Беларусь на весь мир на 9 языках. Круглосуточно. Онлайн. FM. Спутник. Международное радио Беларусь. Для тех, кто далеко, но с нами.
Mr. Paikin, China appeared to be the first country hit by COVID-19, and at the same time, the Chinese government responded to the pandemic could considerably slow down the spread of it. It's obvious that the way Chinese government addressed the pandemic is now often used as instrument of pressure on Chinese government. How did it affect Chinese position on international arena as well as China-US relations?
Well, so China's position right now after the pandemic is quite ambiguous and very difficult to know, because obviously the pandemic will still be with us for several months to come, and so there are many dynamics that have yet to be played out. Certainly it looks like the two major powers in the world today, the United States and China, are both going to come out of this pandemic looking like losers to a certain extent. The question is who's going to look more like a loser. And it looks like at this point that's more likely than not to be the United States at this point. It's entirely possible, and there's been a great amount of analysis on this so far, that simply because of the state-driven structure of the Chinese economy and other factors as well, it is quite likely that China could increase its economic presence in parts of the Eurasian heartland, including in Russia and Central Asia. So even though in terms of its sort of reputational damage, China to a certain extent might come out a loser, even if of course it shows that it's capable to manage the pandemic better than others, because there are a number of irritants that have emerged in China's relations with a number of countries, particularly Western countries, as a result of this pandemic. But putting all of that aside, putting the reputational damage aside, it's entirely possible that there will be ways in which China's presence in certain arenas of international affairs will be reinvigorated by this pandemic, whereas the United States is in the process right now of a fundamental rethink of its future role in the world and whether or not it wants to continue with quote-unquote leadership, which has guided its international strategy for the past 3 decades. So that's something that the U.S. is going to have a long, hard think about. And it's entirely possible that they'll avoid the question altogether come the election in November.
Unlike the United States, in many ways, Europe still approaches China as a partner. But as draft document outlining Germany's plans for the presidency of the Council of Europe in the second half of this year reads, we want to develop cooperation with China and to work for more reciprocity in all areas. What could it mean for EU-China relations?
Well, so yeah, you're absolutely right to note that the approach that the European Union is going to take towards China will significantly differ from the approach that the European Union is going to, the approach that the United States, is going to take towards China. And that could be due to a number of factors. Part of it could be geography and the reality that, there is a significant more amount of trade flow, a higher trade flow between Europe and Asia than there is, for example, between North America and Europe or North America and Asia. North America is much more economically self-sufficient. And so issues of connectivity throughout the Eurasian landmass are always going to be more important. And then part of it, of course, has to do with the structure of the European Union itself. As the European Union is not a traditional Westphalian state, if you will, and therefore, while it does certainly compete in terms of its regulatory order, it does not balance in the traditional sense as regular states or regular great powers would. And to a certain extent, you also see a difference in the approach that the European Union takes towards Russia, which differs from the approach that the United States takes towards Russia. So there's certainly an animus between the United States and Russia, and it's very difficult to imagine any substantive improvement in that relationship for some time. But Europe and Russia share a common sort of European origin, and it's more of an alienation rather than a full-blown animus that the two of them are experiencing. So, you have seen in recent years a sterner approach that the European Union has taken towards China, of course, most famously with the European Commission document noting that the European Union now considers China to be a systemic rival. But, what does that mean in practical terms? It's hard to know, obviously, because different member states of the European Union are going to want to adopt different approaches to dealing with China. There are some that are very eager to sign up to elements of China's Belt and Road Initiative, like Italy and Greece, possibly because they have no option, possibly because there is, a genuine sort of a deepening relationship there. And you're also going to see differences between leading European states like France and Germany and European institutions themselves. That's guaranteed. There's never going to be perfect harmony between these things. And of course, European states will have to have significant discussions with one another if they want to develop harmony between these things. But there is nonetheless always going to be a little bit of daylight between European institutions and their desires and the desires of member states. And it's worth noting, that the European Union, while it does, now officially consider China to be a systemic rival, that does not necessarily mean that it's prepared for a full-blown Cold War or balancing effort the way that the United States might be at this point in time. And Josip Borrell's recent comments in that regard, I think, are quite illuminating. So the European Union is going to have to find some sort of way to provide a sober and realistic take on China, to find ways in which they can continue to cooperate where they share interests, but also to be a little bit realistic where in certain instances that's not possible. But the EU, in doing that, can certainly try to, certainly not be equidistant between the United States and China, but nonetheless act as a stabilizing force in their relationship that can try to slow the descent of the world into bipolarity and into full-blown rivalry. And that's something that the EU should be in favor of. That's something that Russia also should be in favor of, avoiding bipolarity. It's something that Canada, my home country, can also be in favor of. And whether or not our various diverging interests can be compartmentalized or put aside for a bit in order to reinvigorate the international order and avoid a descent into a Cold War and into bipolarity, if that is indeed where we are headed, is something that all of these different countries and entities will have to think about going forward. And it's going to be some difficult decisions that will have to be made, but these questions are going to be with us for some time.
As both China and Russia have rather strained relations with the European Union and the United States, could it lead to broader cooperation between two countries?
Between which two countries?
Between China and Russia.
Between China and Russia, certainly, absolutely. I mean, that has been a dynamic that has preceded the COVID dynamic for quite some time. So that as I mentioned earlier, it looks as if the conditions as a result of COVID are ripe for a further deepening, at least in economic terms, of the relationship between Russia and China, but also in political terms. Simply because the Russia-West rivalry shows no sign of abating anytime soon, and that's partly because it's rooted in fundamentally different visions for the future of European security and of global order more broadly. As a result, if the United States in particular, and the West more broadly, is interested in launching a strategy of some sort of dual containment, even if it is a form of soft containment, against both Russia and China simultaneously, that is naturally going to drive closer ties between Russia and China. So under these current conditions right now, a deepening strategic partnership between Russia and China absolutely suits both sides. It is very much the bedrock of Russia's foreign policy right now, seeing as it has no real option to return to deeper ties with the West, at least for the time being. And therefore, China plays a significant role in amplifying Russia's voice on the global stage, despite the fact that it's a declining power. So people talk a lot about the fact that there's a power transition between Russia and China. China's becoming more and more powerful, and therefore Russia is going to be worried about becoming the junior partner. And that's not to say that those fears are not there. Those fears are there to a certain extent. But the fact is that Russia's primary interests still lie to its west, and therefore its strategic partnership with China is in many ways a key to Russia maintaining great power status on the global level, in its relationship with the West. And in any event, that power transition between Russia and China has largely already occurred, right? It has occurred in recent decades. China is now unambiguously, except for on a few issues like nuclear issues, for example, the senior partner, the bigger brother at this point. And as for China, if China's relationship with the United States is going to deteriorate, and we've seen just yesterday its relationship with India, tensions with India, of course, which have been mounting for some time, also boil over. It's very much in China's interest not to be encircled, and so its strategic partnership with Russia will also be of significant value to it, not just for economic reasons, but for political ones as well. So that logic is there. It'll certainly endure, I believe, at least over the medium term. And history is moving very quickly these days, so we have no idea, under what circumstances it might fall apart. Certainly, there's an argument to be made that obviously China values its relationship with the United States more than it values its relationship with Russia, at least in economic terms, and that Russia's primary interests lie to the West and not with China. But that's not necessarily a knock on the Sino-Russian strategic partnership. To the contrary, it is precisely because their shared neighborhood in Central Asia is, while important, of secondary nature to their respective primary core interests that lie in Eastern Europe and in East Asia for Russia and China respectively. It's because of the secondary nature of that Central Asian theater that the two countries are actually able to cooperate so easily, even though sometimes it does, of course, happen by accident. For example, due to the porous nature of the Eurasian Economic Union. But nonetheless, that is a factor that has actually facilitated the gradual rapprochement between those two great powers.
Now let's talk about Belarus-China relations. The countries proclaimed strategic partnership, and what, in your opinion, is China's interest towards cooperation with Belarus? Because the potential of two countries is incomparable. Giant Asian tiger and a small country in Europe.
Sure. So, the relations between Belarus and China are certainly developing. As you know, you land in Minsk airport and you'll see signs in English, Russian, and Chinese characters. You leave the airport and you see this, magnificent industrial park with Chinese flags that is supposed to be a major node in China's Belt and Road Initiative. So, the dynamics driving that relationship, are quite clear. Obviously, Belarus is interested in deepening ties with the United States, with the European Union, with Canada, and with China as possible counterweights to its relationship with Russia. But those are, for the most part, at least for the time being, diplomatic counterweights rather than actual genuine economic alternatives. And we've seen this, play out in recent months, in which Belarus and Russia have been engaged in protracted negotiations over the future of the pricing of natural resources. The fact is, this reveals that Belarus's economy is still significantly, at least for the time being, dependent upon Russia. We saw the Belarus begin to import, oil from Norway as an alternative for a brief period. But at the end of the day, I don't know if cost-wise that's actually going to be durable. So my guess is that Belarus is doing its best to try to drive a hard bargain by engaging with these other diplomatic partners vis-a-vis Russia. But at the end of the day, the Belarusian economy remains significantly dependent on its partnership with Russia, and this is going to be an interesting balancing act going forward that other countries, small and medium-sized, are going to learn from. I think it's a prime example to see to what extent countries like Belarus and other smaller countries can find ways to navigate the increasingly uneasy waters between great powers as the relations between those great powers begin to decelerate or descend rather into rivalry.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure to talk to you too.
Беларусь на весь мир на 9 языках. Круглосуточно. Онлайн. FM. Спутник. Международное радио Беларусь. Для тех, кто далеко, но с нами.